There's a sentence in the first book of the Bible that seems far too small for the immense weight of what it suggests. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Less than 100 words in the original Hebrew. It mentions the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, and a direct consequence, giants who walked the earth. Is it a poetic metaphor? Theological propaganda to justify the Great Flood? Or an attempt to record something that surpassed the language available in the Bronze Age? The problem isn't just the ambiguity, it's that this sentence connects to the Book of Enoch, the accounts of King Og of Bashan, Mount Hermon, and a list of measurements scattered across texts separated by centuries, all converging around a specific height. 13 feet. If you stay until the end, you will understand why this convergence is no coincidence, what the Book of Enoch explains about this scale, and where the textual and physical evidence creates problems that no simple explanation can resolve alone. Today, you will receive 3 deliveries. First, what the texts actually say, not what popular tradition turned into folklore, but the technical vocabulary used in Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the Book of Enoch to describe the Nephilim and their origin. Second, why the height of 13 feet appears as a standard, not a random number, and how this measure fits into ancient proportion systems and archaeological reports of skeletons and tombs that defy regional patterns. Third, which interpretations survive textual analysis and which crumble, and why academic orthodoxy and literal readings face symmetrical, yet opposite problems. By the end, you won't have a final answer. You'll have something more useful, knowing where each explanation holds the weight and where it starts to crack. And let's start with the anchor text. Genesis 6 opens with a description containing 3 elements: sons of God taking human wives, Nephilim on the earth in those days, and heroes of renown resulting from that union. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. Nephilim can be translated as the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall, which already creates 2 possible readings. If they are the fallen, it reinforces the idea of beings who descended or were cast out from a previous position. If they are those who cause others to fall, it suggests their function was to crush resistance, cause terror, and dominate populations. Both translations work grammatically. Both create different interpretive consequences. Now, Genesis 6 does not specify height. It gives no measurement. It only says they were Gibborim, heroes, men of renown. The word Gibborim comes from Gibbor, which means mighty warrior or champion. It is not an automatic synonym for giant, but there is an important grammatical construction. Genesis 6, verse 4, ends by saying the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This, and also afterward, is an interpretive bomb that explodes slowly. Why? Because if Nephilim existed before the flood and also after, it implies genetic continuity or reappearance. And it is exactly after the flood that the texts begin to give measurements. Numbers 13, verse 33. The scouts sent by Moses return from Canaan and report having seen Nephilim, descendants of Anak, saying, "We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Grasshoppers. This implies extreme proportion. An average Bronze Age man in the region stood between 5'3" and 5'7". If he felt like a grasshopper, the scale points to something over 10 feet, likely close to or above 13, but that is still figurative language. Where do direct numbers appear? King Og of Bashan, Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its width, according to the common cubit. 9 cubits long. The common Hebrew cubit varies between 17 and 18 inches, depending on the source and period. If we use 18 inches as an average, 9 cubits equals 13.5 feet. This is not Og's height. It is the measurement attributed to his bed. The obvious question, were beds in ancient cultures usually larger than the person? Yes, for comfort and status. But the typical difference was 4 to 8 inches. If the bed was 13.5 feet long, Og was likely between 12 and 13 feet tall. Still, a monstrous height. But there is a technical problem. The text says the bed was made of iron. Iron in the late Bronze Age is rare, though not impossible. Meteoric iron was worked in small quantities. But an entire iron bed, 13 feet long, that requires a furnace, mastery of high temperatures, and controlled alloying. Bashan has no archaeological evidence of advanced iron metallurgy at this level during the period attributed to Og, the late 15th or early 14th century BC. So we have 3 options. First, the bed was symbolic, a piece of propaganda created later to aggrandize Og. Second, the bed existed but was imported or looted from a more advanced culture. Third, the account is correct, but our dating of metallurgical capabilities is wrong. None of these options are simple. OG is called the last of the Rephaim. Rephates, or Rephaim, appear repeatedly as a people of great stature. Deuteronomy 2, verse 20. That also was accounted a land of Rephaim. Rephaim dwelt therein in old time, and the Ammonites call them Zamzummim. Verse 21, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Anakim are the sons of Anak, whom Numbers 13 directly connects to the Nephilim. This textual genealogical chain, Nephilim, Anakim, Rephates, Og, creates a line of continuity, and all are described with extraordinary height. Joshua 12, verse 4 reinforces this. And the territory of Og, king of Bashan, who was of the remnant of the Rephaim, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and at Edrei. Ashtaroth and Edrei are real locations. Ashtaroth is near Mount Hermon. This geographic location is not accidental. Mount Hermon is cited in the book of Enoch as the place where the Watchers, the sons of God from Genesis 6, descended and made a pact before taking human wives. Enoch is not in the traditional Judeo-Christian canon except in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it is quoted in Jude, verse 14, and was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In other words, it was a well-known and influential text in Second Temple Judaism. To ignore it would be to ignore one of the primary interpretive sources used by the ancient authors themselves. The book of Enoch, chapter 6, describes 200 watchers descending to Mount Hermon under the leadership of Semyaza. They choose human women and father children. Chapter 7, verses 2 through 6. And they became pregnant, and they bare large giants, whose stature was 3,000 ells. 3,000 ells, or cubits, that would be nearly a mile high, obviously impossible. This number is considered corrupt by scholars, likely the result of a copying error or symbolic interpolation. Greek manuscripts of the Book of Enoch say 300 cubits instead of 3,000, which would be 450 feet, still absurd. But Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran suggest another reading, 3,000 rishon, where rishon is not a cubit, but a different unit, possibly related to heads or generations. The textual confusion is real, but Enoch 7, verse 12 gives another number. And the giants began to devour the labor of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This verse gives no direct measurement, but it implies enormous body mass, enough to consume the resources of entire populations. If we assume a 13-foot giant would have proportional body mass, we are talking about roughly 900 to 1,300 pounds. To sustain that, a daily caloric intake between 8,000 and 12,000 calories would be necessary, depending on activity levels. A Bronze Age agricultural society produced limited food surplus. If you have a population of giants with those demands, the strain on local production would be unsustainable within a few years. This would explain Enoch's narrative about giants devouring the labor of men. But let's get to the central technical point. Why does 13 feet appear as a standard? Og, 13 feet, Goliath, 6 cubits and a span, which equals about 9'6" or 9'9", depending on the textual variant. The Septuagint says 4 cubits and a span, which is about 6'9", but the Masoretic text says 6 cubits. This variation is important because it reflects different measurement traditions or transmission errors. However, in both versions, Goliath is over 6.5 feet tall, already outside the normal human range. Anakim, described as so tall the spies felt like grasshoppers. If we take the metaphor as a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning they were 3 times the perceived visual height of a 5'7" man, we reach values between 16 and 18 feet. Rephates, described as great and many. If Og is the last and is 13 feet tall, it suggests the average height of the Rephates was in that range. Now, is 13 feet compatible with human biology? Not without severe problems. The tallest human ever recorded with medical confirmation was Robert Wadlow at 8'11". He had gigantism caused by a pituitary tumor and died at 22 due to lower limb complications and infection. Above 10 feet, gravitational pressure on joints, especially knees and hips, becomes critical. A 13-foot being would need a radically different skeletal structure, higher density, reinforced joints, and a cardiovascular system capable of pumping blood to the brain against increased gravity. This isn't evolutionarily impossible, but it would require a genetically isolated lineage with specific selective pressure over thousands of generations, or deliberate genetic intervention, which brings us back to the Book of Enoch. Enoch chapter 8 describes the Watchers teaching humans forbidden secrets: metallurgy, weapons, cosmetics, spells, astrology, and the manipulation of roots and plants. Verse 1. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. This implies technology transfer. If the Watchers had superior knowledge, could they have had knowledge of genetic modification? This is a modern reading, obviously. Enoch was written between 300 and 100 BC in Aramaic and Hebrew without concepts of DNA or genetics, but the text describes the corruption of the flesh, not just moral, but physical. Enoch 7, verse 5. And the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Jubilees 5, verse 2, another text from the period, says that corruption was in all flesh. This language of carnal corruption is used to describe the mixing of seeds, of lineages. Leviticus uses similar terminology when forbidding the crossbreeding of different types of cattle. So the question becomes, did the ancient authors understand that something genetically wrong was happening, even without modern vocabulary? And if so, how did they know? The standard academic answer is, they didn't know. They were constructing an ideological myth to explain why God sent the flood. But what if the direction of causality is reversed? What if the narrative of the flood was built to explain a real event of forced extinction of a lineage that represented an existential threat? Well, let's look at the archaeological problem. Are there 13-foot skeletons? There are none confirmed in museums with secure dating and context. There are reports. Many. Most are documented frauds or misinterpretations. For example, in 1896, the New York Times published an article about a giant skeleton found in Ohio. There was never any confirmation. In 1912, another report about a 10-foot skeleton in Wisconsin. It also vanished, a recurring pattern. Sensational discovery, absence of physical evidence, folkloric narrative. But there are exceptions. In 1936, German anthropologist Larsen Kohl reported finding skeletons with estimated heights between 8 and 10 feet in Middle Eastern sites. His records were lost during World War II. In 1958, during construction in Gargayan, Philippines, workers found unusually large human femurs. The pieces were sent for analysis, but the results were never published. The pattern is always the same. Allegation, lack of independent confirmation, disappearance of evidence. This raises two possibilities. First, it is all fabrication and misinterpretation of megafauna bones, bears, mammoths, mistaken for human remains. Second, there was active suppression because the evidence didn't fit the dominant anthropological model of the time. Which is more likely? Academic orthodoxy argues that giants in the Bible are military hyperbole. Ogi was just a tall king, maybe 6'10" or 7'2", and Hebrew propaganda exaggerated to glorify Israel's victory. This is reasonable. Military propaganda always inflates the defeated enemy. But there's a problem. If Og was just a tall king, why was the iron bed preserved and displayed in Rabbah as a real artifact? The text of Deuteronomy asks, is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? This rhetorical question implies the bed was verifiable, available for inspection. If it were an obvious lie, any later scribe would have removed the reference upon realizing no one had ever seen such a bed. The fact that the reference was preserved suggests there was something in Rabbah that could be pointed to as Og's bed, or at least an artifact large enough to support the narrative. Rabbah is modern-day Amman, the capital of Jordan, a rich archaeological site. 20th century excavations found walls, temples, and tombs from the Bronze and Iron Ages. No giant bed was found. But that isn't surprising. The city was destroyed, rebuilt, and occupied by Romans, Byzantines, and Muslims. 1,500 years of continuous occupation destroy earlier layers. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's not evidence of presence either. We are left with probability, not certainty. Another point in favor of hyperbole, the text of Numbers 13 with the spies. Out of the 12 spies, 10 returned terrified, speaking of giants. 2, Joshua and Caleb, said the land was conquerable and minimized the size of the enemies. If Nephilim were literally 13 feet tall, Joshua and Caleb would be madmen or suicidal to suggest a frontal attack. But if the Anakim were just tall, well-armed men, say 6'6" to 7'2", then the reaction of the 10 spies would be cowardly but not insane, and Joshua and Caleb's courage would make tactical sense. This reading preserves the rationality of the text without needing literal giants, but it creates another problem. Why does the text of Numbers use the word Nephilim to describe the Anakim if Nephilim had already been used in Genesis 6 to describe a specific pre-flood race? If Nephilim is just a synonym for tall people, why not use Rephaim or Gibborim, which are more common terms? The choice of Nephilim creates a direct and deliberate connection to Genesis 6, implying that the authors believed there was genetic or functional continuity between the antediluvian Nephilim and the post-flood giants. And that brings us to the central problem of "and also afterward." Genesis 6, verse 4. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. If the flood extinguished all terrestrial life except Noah and his family, how did the Nephilim return? There are 3 traditional answers. First, there was genetic contamination within Noah's family. This is the reading of some rabbinic texts suggesting that the wife of Ham carried Nephilim genes. But Genesis 6, verse 9 says, Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word used is tamim, which means complete or without blemish. In the context of genealogical and physical purity, this would imply Noah's genetic line was intact. If the wife of one of his sons were contaminated, the text would likely have made a reservation. Second answer, the watchers descended again after the flood. This is the reading of Enoch and texts like the Book of Jubilees. Enoch 10, verse 12 speaks of watchers being imprisoned, but not all of them. Some remained active. Jubilees 5 suggests recurring cycles of intervention, but this creates a theological problem. Why would God allow new contamination after having destroyed the first? Third answer. Nephilim were not the product of genetic hybridization, but of a natural human lineage that developed gigantism through mutation or a specific environment. In other words, they weren't supernatural, just unusual. This is the standard academic position. The Rephates were simply a tall ethnic group inhabiting Bashan. The Enochim, another tall group in Canaan. Og, a king of that ethnicity. End of story. This explanation is elegant, but it has a distribution problem. Tales of giants don't just appear in the Bible, they appear in Homer, Cyclopes, who built megalithic walls. They appear in Norse mythology, Jotuns, frost and mountain giants. They appear in Hindu myths, Daityas and Danavas. They appear in Native American traditions, the Site Ka in Nevada, red-haired giants who were exterminated in war. They appear in Greek mythology, Titans, bronze giants born of Gaia. They appear in Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki, described as tall and powerful. They appear in Chinese myths, Quafu, a giant who chased the sun. Now, cultures separated by oceans and millennia developed the same central narrative. Beings of great stature who dominated, oppressed, or corrupted human populations before being destroyed or driven out. Could this just be a psychological archetype? Carl Jung would argue yes. The giant as a symbol of the uncontrolled ego of wild nature, of the primordial father who must be defeated for civilization to advance. Joseph Campbell would say it's the monomyth, the hero's journey against chthonic forces, but there's a difference between an archetype and a cultural memory. Archetypes appear in any culture because they reflect structures of the human psyche. Cultural memories appear in connected cultures because there was contact or common ancestry. If the giant accounts were merely archetypes, we would expect vast variations in the details, but the details are surprisingly consistent. Height over 10 feet, immense strength, a relationship with stone and construction, violent destruction or forced expulsion, an association with mountains and high places. This proves nothing, but it raises the hypothesis of a diffuse cultural memory, that something happened in the remote past, was recorded in oral narratives, and these narratives spread before the dispersion of populations. Do you think giants were real or just a metaphor? And if they were real, how do we explain the lack of confirmed skeletons? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this discussion is exactly the kind of debate this channel needs to grow. And if you're enjoying this investigation, share it with someone who loves ancient history and archaeology. The algorithm only pushes the video if you interact. Let's continue. Now, let's go to Mount Hermon. 3 peaks, 9,232 feet high. The border between Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. The Hebrew name, Hermon, comes from the root haram, which means consecrated, forbidden, or set apart. The Arabic name is Jabal Ash-Sheikh, Mountain of the Elder. Enoch 6, verse 6. And they all swore together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. Why Hermon? First reason, altitude. Mount Hermon is the highest peak in the region, visible from the entire Jezreel Valley and the Sea of Galilee. It holds strategic and symbolic significance. In ancient cultures, mountains were considered link points between heaven and earth. Jacob's Ladder, Mount Sinai, Olympus. Second reason, the name. If Hermon comes from Haram, consecrated, it implies the mountain already had religious status before Israel occupied the region. Third reason, archaeology. There are ancient shrines on the summit and slopes of Hermon. One dates to the Middle Bronze Age between 2000 and 1500 BC, another to the Iron Age. These shrines were not Israelite, they were Canaanite, possibly dedicated to Baal Hermon, a local deity mentioned in Judges 3, verse 3. This means Hermon was a religious center for pre-Israelite populations, including, potentially, the Rephates. Enoch is not inventing geography. It is using a real location with real religious significance and connecting that location to a narrative about the Watchers. The question is, why did the author of Enoch choose Hermon? If the intention was to create theological fiction, any mountain would work. Mount Sinai would carry more weight, as it was already associated with divine revelation. But Enoch specifies Hermon, which was associated with Baal and non-Israelite cults. This suggests there was an oral tradition linking Hermon to the Watchers, a tradition predating the text of Enoch. And if there was a tradition, where did it come from? Possibility 1, it was created by the Canaanites to explain why Hermon was sacred. Possibility 2, it was created by the Rephites or Anakim to justify their origin. Possibility 3, it reflected a real event that occurred at Hermon and was remembered through generations. None of these possibilities can be confirmed without additional evidence. But Enoch is not writing in a vacuum. It reflects traditions circulating in Second Temple Judaism, and those traditions connected Hermon, the Watchers, and giants. Now let's look at the question of proportion. If Nephilim were 13 feet tall and normal humans were 5'7", the ratio is about 2, 35 to 1. This creates practical problems. First, housing. Bronze Age houses had ceilings between 6 and 8 feet high. A 13-foot being doesn't fit. He would have to build specific dwellings, which would leave a distinctive archaeological footprint. Is there evidence of this? In Bashan, Og's region, there are structures known as dolmens, megalithic monuments made of large stone slabs. Some have internal chambers with heights of 10 to 11 feet. This is unusual. Dolmens are tombs, not dwellings, but the size suggests they were made for large bodies. The problem is that the Bashan dolmens date between 3000 and 2000 BC, which is earlier than Og's period. But if the Rephites were an ancient population of Bashan, these dolmens could be the tombs of their ancestors. Deuteronomy 3, verse 13 says, Bashan was the land of Rephaim. Joshua 12, verse 4 confirms this. Joshua 13, verse 12 mentions that Moses defeated the last of the Rephites. This indicates that Rephites occupied Bashan for an extensive time, possibly centuries. And if they occupied it for centuries, they left infrastructure. Baalbek, in Lebanon, about 25 miles south of Mount Hermon, a megalithic platform with limestone blocks weighing between 800 and 1,000 tons each. To move these, the Romans, who built the Temple of Jupiter on top of them, would have needed thousands of workers and complex systems of pulleys and cranes. Even then, they would struggle to move 1,000 tons. And the Romans had concrete engineering, steel tools, and advanced mechanical knowledge. If it wasn't the Romans, who built it? Local Lebanese tradition says it was giants. That is the folkloric answer. Archaeology says it doesn't know. There are no inscriptions, no tools left on site, no written record of who cut or moved those blocks. Baalbek is near Hermon. It is in a region that was Og's territory, or close to it, and it has blocks that defy conventional explanation. This doesn't prove giants, but it creates a context where the narrative of giants gains plausibility as a distorted memory of a population with superior technological capability. There is another technical detail. 13 feet of height implies large hands. A 6-foot man has hands about 7 to 8 inches long. Direct proportion, a 13-foot being would have hands about 16 inches long. Tools made for these hands would be larger, heavier. Axes, hammers, swords. If Rephites or Anakim used weapons, those weapons would be distinct. Is there evidence? There are reports of giant weapons found in old excavations, but need to have a similar number of chromosomes and a close genetic structure. For example, horses have 64 chromosomes, donkeys have 62. The crossbreed produces a mule, which has 63 chromosomes and is sterile for Watchers and humans, to crossbreed and generate fertile Nephilim, because the text implies Nephilim produced offspring, the Rephites and Anakim. A very close genetic compatibility would be required. This means that either the Watchers were biologically human or near human, or the narrative is allegorical, and sons of God is not a reference to literal beings, but to the lineage of Seth, or an aristocracy that intermingled with common populations. This has been the reading of many Jewish and Christian commentators since Augustine. Sons of God would be descendants of Seth, the righteous line. Daughters of men would be descendants of Cain, the corrupt line. The problem with this reading, why would the crossbreeding of two human lineages produce giants? There is no biological mechanism that explains this, unless the sons of God were an isolated population that developed distinct height through natural selection, something like the Watusi of Central Africa, who have an average height of 6'6", but even then, uses Bene Elohim, textual precedent points to non-human beings. To ignore this is to force a reading that contradicts the technical use of the expression in other parts of the Bible. So we have a stalemate. If Bene Elohim are celestial beings, we need to explain how they biologically interbred with humans. If Bene Elohim are humans, we need to explain why the text uses celestial terminology. Both readings have an interpretive cost. Academic orthodoxy chooses the cost of reinterpreting Bene Elohim as metaphor or anachronism. The literal reading chooses the cost of assuming non-human beings had compatible biology. Neither is free of problems. But the literal reading has an advantage. It explains why the Book of Enoch, written centuries later, preserved and expanded exactly this interpretation. If the reading of Bene Elohim as celestial beings were a late misunderstanding, we would expect older texts to correct it. But ancient rabbinic texts, such as the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, translate Bene Elohim as sons of the powerful, but still preserve the narrative of the resulting giants. In other words, even when they try to soften the supernatural implication, they maintain the physical result, giants. And this suggests that to place under a ban, to destroy completely. This is the same type of language used for Amalek, 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. Both the Rephates and Amalek are marked for total destruction. This is not conventional warfare. It is intentional elimination. The standard theological reason is that these populations practiced idolatry, child sacrifice, and moral corruption that threatened to contaminate Israel. But the text adds a detail. They were descendants of Nephilim. If the Nephilim were the product of a forbidden hybridization between celestials and humans, then the Rephates carried a genetic contamination that had to be eliminated, not out of racial prejudice, but out of a need for lineage purity so that the messianic promise, a descendant of Abraham who would bless all nations, could be fulfilled without corruption. If the messianic line were contaminated with Nephilim DNA, the plan of redemption would be compromised. This sounds like heavy, abstract theology, but it has internal logic. If you accept the premise that there is a specific divine plan depending on a pure human lineage, then the existence of a hybrid lineage is an existential threat and must be eliminated. If this is correct, the conquest of Canaan was not just territorial war. It was a continuation of the flood, a cleansing of Nephilim lineages that were not eliminated by the water. This makes the order of extermination less arbitrary and more functional within the narrative's logic. But there are modern implications. If the Nephilim were exterminated, are they truly extinct? Some argue that Nephilim lineages persist. Evidence presented people with extreme gigantism, families with an average height over 6'6", isolated populations with unusual physical characteristics. This is speculation without basis. Modern gigantism is caused by hormonal dysfunctions, pituitary tumors, Soto's syndrome, Marfan syndrome. There is no evidence of a separate genetic lineage. Tall populations like the Dinka in Sudan or the Tutsi in Rwanda have an average height of 6 feet to 6'6", the result of natural selection in specific environments. That isn't Nephilim. It's normal human variation. So the evidence-based answer is there are no Nephilim lineages alive today. But narratively, the fact that Israel received the order to exterminate them and the text says they obeyed suggests a conclusion. The Nephilim were successfully eliminated. Og was the last of the Rephates. After Og, there is no further mention of giants as an organized population in the Bible. Goliath, who appears centuries later, is an individual exception, possibly a disproportionate threat. If this is read as a distorted historical narrative, then we might be looking at the memory of a genocidal war between two populations, one with a significant physical advantage, the other with a numerical and strategic advantage, and the smaller population was eliminated. The narrative was preserved in theological clothing, but the core could be a tribal recollection of a real conflict. But there is another possible reading. What if Nephilim were not physical but represented structures of power? Giant not as a large body, but as an empire, a tyranny, a system of domination that crushes individuals. In this reading, 13 feet tall is a metaphor for the magnitude of disproportionate power. And the order to destroy the Rephates would be in order to destroy systems of oppression that Israel encountered in Canaan. Child sacrifice to Moloch, cult prostitution, debt slavery, a military aristocracy that drained peasant resources. This interpretation is spiritually attractive and morally useful, but it has a textual problem. The text of Deuteronomy doesn't speak of destroying systems. It speaks of destroying peoples. It uses the language of physical extermination, not social reform. So if we want to preserve this reading, we must admit we are reinterpreting the text against its literal intention, which is legitimate in a modern theological context, but not in historical analysis. So where does that leave us? We have texts describing giants with specific measurements. We have traditions connecting these giants to crossbreeding between celestial. Well-fed aristocracy, isolated genetic mutation, work for individual cases like Goliath, but struggle to explain a consistent pattern across multiple populations in different regions. The best available conclusion is, we don't know for sure, but the text preserves a memory of something. It could be a memory of a real population with distinct height. It could be a memory of conflict with a technologically superior culture. It could be a distorted memory of a catastrophic event involving the extermination of a specific lineage. Or it could be an intentional theological construction to explain why certain populations were eliminated. Each of these readings has strengths and weaknesses. None resolve all the problems. The mistake would be to choose one and declare the others impossible. The correct method is to hold the tensions, recognizing that ancient texts operate on multiple levels: historical, theological, mythical, and that untangling these layers is difficult work that rarely yields final answers. But the exercise is valuable, because it forces us to read more carefully, not to assume we know what the text says before we actually investigate, and to respect the complexity of narratives that have been preserved for 3,000 years precisely because they touch something that resonates beyond the literal surface. So 13 feet in height, according to the Book of Enoch and related biblical texts, is not an arbitrary number. It is irreversible corruption. Enoch 15, verses 8 through 12, describes the fate of the Nephilim after death. Their spirits do not rest, but wander as demons, causing oppression. This connects the Nephilim to the demonology of the New Testament. Jesus repeatedly casts out demons. Where do these demons come from? Later, Christian theology says they are fallen angels, but Enoch offers an alternative origin. They are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim killed in the flood. They have no body, so they seek to possess humans. This would explain why exorcisms were necessary. They were clearing the residual contamination of a race that was. Og, king of Bashan, last of the Rephates, slept in a bed 13 feet long. It may have been propaganda, it may have been reality, but the fact is that 3,000 years later we are still discussing it. Texts that survive this long do so because they touch something deep, the fear of forces greater than us, a fascination with what was lost, and the need to understand where we came from and what we were capable of forgetting. Nephilim, watchers, giants. They could be metaphors or memories, but they are memories that have not died. And that, in itself, says something. In the next episode, we'll look at the other side of the coin, those who built without leaving a name. Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years before Christ, and the question no one answers well, who had enough organization to raise that before agriculture even existed? Until then,